Today's a special day, and it's based on a real life story. We all have heard all kinds of stories, but this one is not just a fairy tale. Those of you who have been teachers and you teach children stories, there's different kinds of stories. The story of the gospel is a real life story. And today's lesson, I want to start with just one verse. I want you to hear the verse because it's going to guide our thoughts through John 20, verses 11 through 13. And here's the verse. In verse 18, Mary Magdalene went and announced to the disciples, I have seen the Lord, and that he had said these things to her. You see, the Jesus of faith and the Jesus of history are one and the same. But what's the basic Easter message that brings the two together? Well, we get close when we affirm that Jesus is crucified. We get a little bit closer when we say that Jesus was buried. And we even get more closer, that word, when we affirm that the tomb was empty. But then Easter is important because we see in our life death all around us. Jesus then coming forth from the grave, and for Mary to say, I have seen him, tempers the teeth of death. A friend of mine recently lost his 36-year-old brother to addiction. A colleague of mine lost her 57-year-old sister to addiction. Another colleague of mine lost his 92-year-old father. And he said, well, he's lived a full, long life. We also know the death of the children and the adults at Covenant School in Nashville. There have been 2 weekends of rounds of tornadoes where nearly 50 people total have died over those 2 weekends. And we could go on and on where we see all around us death. But death has been overcome by Jesus. That's what brings us here. Do you realize that your presence here this morning is saying, I vote for the reality, I believe death doesn't have the final word. Listen to how the writer of the book of Hebrews in chapter 2, verses 14 and 15 describes it. Boy, this is incredible. Talking about Jesus, since humanity has flesh and blood, Jesus too shared in their humanity, so that by his death, I want you to listen to this. We sometimes just kind of gloss over this. By his death, he might break the power of him who holds the power of death. That is the devil. And free those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death. That's what the resurrection will do for us. We are not held in slavery by the fear of death. Some people live as if they have chains around them because they fear death. And they let that fear define every single thing they think and what they do and choices they make. And the writer of Hebrews says, no, Christ took care of that. We don't have to be held bondage with that. But we get the core powerful gospel message. When we hear Mary Magdalene announce to the disciples, I have seen the Lord. Have you ever wished that you could have been in her shoes? So many people during Mary's day attested to the fact that Jesus really did come out of the grave. Early preaching in America was all about Jesus' resurrection. In fact, one preacher made this observation: the gospel really is facts to be believed, teachings to be followed, and promises to be embraced. Well, that's a pretty good shorthand for the good gospel message, isn't it? And if that simple model is kind of the lens through which you see the gospel message, then if the resurrection didn't happen, well, guess what? There's no teachings to follow. And guess what? There's certainly no promises to be embraced. That doesn't mean a thing. In 1 Corinthians 15, the Apostle Paul talks about that. He takes the same approach. If there had been no resurrection, he makes this comment. We of all men are most miserable because, first of all, we're wasting our time with a message that doesn't mean anything. Well, he gave his life to a message that meant something. And if you look at 1 Corinthians 15:58, this could be a whole another sermon I could tack on. Paul doesn't just talk about the certainty of the resurrection, but he ends with what I call sort of a encouraging note for each one of us as we're living out our personal ministry as a Christian. And here's what he said, that you can be sure that the labor, the things that you do for the Lord, it's not going to be in vain. Maybe nobody else notices, 1 Corinthians 15:58, but guess what? You did it. The Lord is sitting at the right hand of God. He sees it. He knows it's not in vain. And one thing about the resurrection is, and I love this part of it, it's a message loud and clear. Because Jesus was raised from the dead, our lives mean something. You are a person of value and worth. Your life means something. And we need to hear this. It's the value behind who we are and what we do. So when Mary made this announcement, how does it help us understand the Easter message? I think there are 4 ways, and they're pretty powerful or simple, but I want to share them with you. The first, and we may not get this if you don't read in the Gospels earlier, when she said, I have seen the Lord, guess what? She was confessing that Jesus was her Lord. He had changed her life. If you know the gospel story, let me just share one verse with you. In Luke 8:2, this describes her past life. And also there were some women who had been cured of evil spirits and diseases. I'm going to talk about people that are right there with Jesus. Mary, called Magdalene, and that's the Mary in John 20, from whom 7 demons have been cast out. I can't imagine what a life was like having 7 demons in you. Now, we don't get the full description. I'm not sure I would want one. A life with 7 demons. Jesus' life touched hers. Her life was forever changed. What a radical change. No wonder she followed Jesus. And we're not surprised that she visited the tomb so early and was one of the first to share the good news with the apostles. You didn't have to force her to get up early. I'm not an early morning person. My mode of life is somehow mind has to get over mattress and I got to get up. So if I stayed in bed until I felt like getting up, it might be noon. But she went early. Nobody had to twist her arm. She was there because Jesus had radically changed her life. She was with Mary, the mother of James, and also Joanna. All 3 of these ran to the apostles and told them the good news. I've always seen this part of the story as saying 2 important things. One is, it's first of all, 3 women. And these women ran to tell the apostles the good news. In the ancient world in which Jesus lived, women didn't have it so well. And I see this as part of the good news, saying something like this. It's a very subtle but powerful message. It doesn't matter if you're male or female, you have equal value before God. And Jesus at the cross died for you, doesn't matter who you are. It's a very powerful message. Now, here's the second thing. And this just dawned on me this week. In fact, I got so excited I shared it with Nancy. An insight. Maybe the Spirit gave it to me, but you got to hear this. When those three women went and told the apostles that they saw the Lord, they had to believe her testimony to go look for themselves. And guess what? When those apostles went all over Asia Minor after the day of Pentecost preaching the gospel, they were involved in the same kind of process, asking people that were listening to them to believe something they hadn't seen. They knew what that was like because they'd already been through that. The three women told them they had to believe it, then go. That's why in John we have this really interesting, and I'm going to come to Thomas, but we have this interesting comment about Thomas. I think I identify with him because he told the other apostles when they were gathered up in the room, and he had heard the news. Well, Jesus has been raised from the dead. And he goes, "Oh, I'm not going to believe that stuff. I am not going to believe it until I see the print of the nails in his hand and his side where the spear went in." Well, guess what? Jesus shows up in the upper room. "Thomas, come here. I want you to look at something." What was his response? It's amazing. It's short, but it shows you the astonishment of seeing this, my Lord and my God. That was the only thing he could respond to. That's the only thing he could say. Because there it was. And then Jesus makes another wonderful comment. He doesn't leave it there. I've always been amazed at how Jesus uses little moments as teaching moments. He said, "Thomas, it's really good that you believe now, but more blessed are going to be those who have not seen." So that in a way, because we believe Jesus was raised from the dead and we didn't see it, and we're basing our faith on the testimony of those who did, we're more blessed than Thomas was. Now, how many times have you thought to yourself, boy, it would have been so neat to live back in the first century, and as a result of that, I could really see it. I could really believe them. Well, that's not what Jesus says. You think about the faith that it takes, because let's admit it. We're putting all our eggs in one basket, aren't we? We are. We're putting our destiny in one basket. Now, there's some people that like to put a foot in two baskets. One's in this world and maybe one in the next. No, we're putting all of our eggs in one basket. This is true. Now, Mary's life had been changed. The apostles themselves had to go through that same kind of change. Her testimony joins the list in 1 Corinthians 15. Listen to this. Jesus appeared to Peter, then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time. A lot of people. Most of them are still living, even though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me also as the one abnormally born. So Paul even had the risen Jesus appear to him in a special vision. Her confession of seeing Jesus, she said, "I've seen him." It implies a readiness for him to be her Lord again. I have seen the Lord. Also, this is a testimony to the physical reality. The question is, was Jesus really raised from the dead, or did it just seem like he was raised? There was a spin-off of early Christianity in the 2nd and 3rd century, where there are people who said, well, it just kind of seemed like he was raised from the dead. It just kind of seemed like he was. Well, if that's the case, and you deny the reality of the physical resurrection of Jesus, and they also gave it kind of a reference to his ministry, it just seemed like he was in the flesh. He wasn't really just seemed like. Well, that's not what the New Testament affirms, because if it just seemed like he was, then how in the world could Jesus identify with those of us who are in the flesh? I mean, we're living the life of the flesh. For him to be our mediator and intercessor, he needs to know what it was like. And the writer of the book of Hebrews affirms that over and over, many times. the reality of Jesus' life, being on earth, is well attested. See, we're talking about trying to answer the question here. When she said, I have seen him, did she really see him? Was that really real? The New Testament goes out of its way, it seems, to establish the fact Jesus was a real person. Luke chapter 1, verse 5. It sets the stage of Jesus' birth in the days of Herod, king of Judah. Look at how Luke sets the stage for his life further on in chapter 2. In the days Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken over the whole Roman world. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria. Time and place and even activity. Very specific. Even in Luke 1, 1 through 4, there's a fascinating thing there. If you've not read that one recently, there's even a reference to the actual real process of how Luke composed the gospel himself. Of course, we would say that no doubt the Spirit's part of that process. But listen to what he said. He's writing to a guy named Theophilus. And he says, I want you to know of the things that's most surely taught and believed among us. Oh, most excellent Theophilus. We think that Theophilus was high up in the government because of that title. And so he's struggling with, how can I tell the story that everybody around me doesn't even believe it? Well, Luke says, Theophilus, let me tell you the story of Jesus so you can do that. In that first paragraph, Luke says something that's quite astounding. He says, I looked around and investigated other stories that were written, and they weren't good enough. They didn't really tell the story. I am telling you those things that are certainly believed among us. So a certainty is attached to that gospel of Luke. Everything about Jesus, everything about his life, death, burial, resurrection, it's real, and it really happened. I have seen him. I've seen him after he arose. I've seen him. And her message is, I want you to see him now. I want you to listen to John talking about this in his first letter. You talk about being real specific, and John was there. He was what we would call a primary witness of Jesus. 1 John chapter 1. That which was from the beginning, which we've heard, which we've seen with our eyes, which we've looked at, and our hands have handled. Now, how much more tactile and how much more real can this get? Our eyes have seen, we've heard, we've looked at, our hands have touched and handled, the life appeared. We've seen it and testified to it. We proclaim to you the eternal life, which was with the Father and has appeared to us. We proclaim to you what we've seen and heard, so that you may also have fellowship with us. And our fellowship is with the Father, with his Son, Jesus Christ. We write this to make your joy complete. There is a joy in knowing that this whole story of the life of Jesus is real. Another thing in John 20, when she says, I've seen the Lord, in that narrative, Jesus appears when she's weeping. Kind of an interesting part. Now, Mary stood aside, outside the tomb, crying, and she wept. She bent over and she looked into the tomb. She saw two angels dressed in white. One was at the head of where Jesus lay, and the other was at the foot. And they asked her, Woman, why are you crying? She said, Well, they've taken my Lord away, and I don't know where they put him. At this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there. She didn't realize who it was. Didn't realize it was Jesus. He asked her, Woman, why are you crying? Who is it that you're looking for? Thinking that he was the gardener. She said, Sir, if you carried him away, tell me where you put him and I'll go get him. Wow, I want you to notice this about her weeping. She was there at the empty tomb. She'd been over and looked in. Jesus' body was gone. And most likely she thought somebody had taken it. So where did it go? Why are you crying? What are you looking for? Well, they've taken my Lord away. And this is the anguish of a confession on two levels, one in her time and one in ours. She thought Jesus had been taken away. There are a lot of Christians today that, because of people's approach to Scripture and trying to deny what's in there, I actually know people who, because they have been open to listening to criticism against the Bible, they've actually lost their faith. And they say, I'm no longer a Christian. That's such an anguished moment. And it's almost like you can hear in our generation today, people asking, where have they taken my Lord? And in their own life, he's gone. Well, that's not the end of the story. And she thought Jesus was the gardener. There have been a lot of people through the centuries that have misunderstood and misplaced ideas about who Jesus was. Starts off right here. Was Jesus a gardener? No. Was he a Jewish military leader? No. I mean, you can just go down through history. People have wrong ideas about who he was. She had her own plans to fix the problem of the open tomb and find the missing body. I'm always amazed how, when things don't look right from a human perspective, we jump into the mode of trying to fix them. Listen to the rest of her experience. Jesus said to her, Mary, and so she turned toward him. She cried out in Aramaic, Rabboni, which means my teacher. My teacher. When Jesus speaks to our hearts today, we hear him call our name. Jesus is personally interested in each one of us in our times of weeping and searching. And we can hear in our hearts today the resurrected Lord saying, I am here. And he calls our name. She cried out, Rabboni, which means she recognized him. The risen Lord is our teacher also. Means my rabbi or my teacher. He came from an empty tomb, and he's ready to enter empty hearts. Now, as this verse closes out, John 20:18, there's another odd little phrase that, if we're not careful, it's easy just to say, okay, I'll just have to pass over to the next verse. Listen to this. He said these things to her. What are the things he said to her? When you look at that immediate paragraph, in the flow there, it has to do with his ascension. He talked to her about ascending back to the Father. And I mentioned in the newsletter today, if you read the newsletter, that we don't often make that strong connection between resurrection and ascension that we should. What's the resurrection about? I wish we had time to go through chapter 1 of Acts, verses 1 through 11. There's a whole section there on the ascension. But as he talks about, or talks to his disciples, we find out that he spends 40 more days instructing them, getting them ready for him to leave. And it says that he was taken up into heaven. And then it says it again, but Luke uses a stronger verb for taking up. And it's the idea, while they were there talking to Jesus, he was lifted up from their sight. Now, I don't know about you, but if I had been one of the 12, and Jesus is there talking to us on the Mount Olivet, all of a sudden, he goes up like this, and you see him disappear in the clouds. Now, I've never seen anything like that. Have you? I've seen hot air balloons disappear in the cloud. I've seen planes disappear in the cloud. But a person standing there talking to you, and he disappears. He's going to come like that. He's going to come back in the cloud. That's why when we talk about the resurrection, it's important to talk about the ascension, even more to talk about he's coming again. So as we end this lesson with Mary's testimony, I have seen the Lord. What does that mean for us? Because his life has touched ours and he has changed us, we too can say, I've seen the Lord. Because he really came in the flesh, and both Christians and unbelievers has testified to that fact. We can say, I've seen the Lord. I forgot to mention that in 1836, what is that, 190 years ago, there was a book published by Alexander Campbell called The Christian The Christian Preacher's Companion. And the subtitle of that book was The Testimony of Unbelieving Jews and Pagans about the Reality of Jesus. And in that book, he has all his testimony through the centuries of people who didn't believe in Jesus, but they had to admit, yeah, you live, but we don't believe it. Now, when I was over in Oxford at the Bodleian Library, I didn't know that they had an original copy. If I'd have known that, I would have gone and looked at it, 1830. Guess what? Through Walmart, you can order that book now. And that book is leather bound, but it's about $50. So I can tell you what's in the book. The book is testimony of centuries of unbelieving Jews and pagans who didn't believe in Christ as a risen Lord, but they had to admit, yeah, he was a historical figure. We give in, he was real. It's such a neat book. How can we say I've seen the Lord? Because with his empty tomb, he entombs my heart and takes away the angst and the weeping of life. And because he's ascended, he's ministering right now on the right hand of God for me, for you, and we're waiting for him to come. He is risen. He is coming. If you need to come to Jesus this morning and respond to the good news of the gospel, that he wants to live in your heart because he came out of the tomb, let's stand and sing number 215.